When was the last time you heard about Mercury, the car that looked awfully similar to Ford, but was never recognised as such? In reality, Mercury's weird story is even crazier as a whole. This is the story of the brand that struggled to live between two worlds. Back in 1938, a consumer standing in a Ford showroom faced a huge dilemma. On one side was the Ford Deluxe, a respected and capable vehicle that cost roughly $700 back then. On the other side of the room, or more likely at a different dealership across the road, sat the Lincoln Zephyr. The Zephyr was a streamlined masterpiece of Art Deco design, but it carried a price tag of $1,300. In today's value, that $600 difference represents a gap of nearly $13,000. But in the late 1930s, it was more than just a price jump. It was a social barrier. Ford noticed that as their customers became more successful, they didn't necessarily move up to a Lincoln. They simply left. They walked across the street to General Motors and bought an Oldsmobile or a Buick. They went to Chrysler and bought a Dodge. Edsel Ford recognised that his father's company was missing a rung on the ladder. They needed a bridge. That bridge was Mercury. When the first Mercury, the Model 99A, arrived for the 1939 model year, it was designed to be roughly $300 more than a base Ford. It was marketed not as a luxury car, but as a medium-priced car. For the first few years, this strategy worked perfectly. Mercury was a standalone success, selling over 155,000 units in its first 2 years. But this early success masked a fundamental question that would haunt the brand for the next 7 decades. Was Mercury a destination for people who wanted something better than a Ford, or was it simply a waiting room for people who couldn't yet afford a Lincoln? By the late 1950s, Ford briefly experimented with the MEL division, Mercury, Edsel and Lincoln. Though this specific structure was short-lived, the goal was consistent. Mimic the Sloan ladder used by General Motors, where a customer would start with a Chevrolet and eventually retire with a Cadillac. Mercury was supposed to be the middle management of this hierarchy. However, the technical reality was different. To keep Mercury profitable, the engineers had to rely on shared DNA. The early Mercury engines were often just Ford V8s that had been bored out to increase displacement. In 1939, while the standard Ford V8 displaced 221 cubic inches, the Mercury version was pushed to 239 cubic inches. This provided 10 extra horsepower. It was a tangible difference, but it wasn't a different engine. It was a Ford engine with more breathing room. As we move into the 1950s, Mercury tried to break away from this fancy Ford reputation through aggressive styling and gadgetry. This era gave us the Turnpike Cruiser, a vehicle equipped with a breezeway power rear window that lowered vertically. It had a seat-o-matic memory seat and a dashboard filled with gold trim gauges. From a business perspective, the incentive was to make the Mercury feel as complex as a Lincoln while keeping the production costs as low as a Ford. This created the first major contradiction of the brand. When Mercury tried to be too innovative, like with the Turnpike Cruiser, the cars became expensive and unreliable. When they stayed too close to Ford, the customers questioned why they were paying a premium. The brand performed best financially when it stayed close to its Ford roots, but its brand value only increased when it moved away from them. Mercury was effectively being pulled in two opposite directions by its own balance sheet. The 1960s offered a potential escape from this identity crisis. The automotive market was shifting toward performance and youth culture. Ford had the Mustang, which was a runaway success. Mercury's response was the 1967 Cougar. On the surface, the Cougar was a Mustang. It shared the same basic chassis, engines, and transmissions. But the business strategy behind the Cougar is a masterclass in reframing. Mercury engineers increased the wheelbase by 3 inches. They added significantly more sound insulation and refined the suspension bushings to create a European ride quality. They marketed the Cougar not as a pony car, but as a luxury sports car. It featured hidden headlights and sequential rear turn signals, mechanical flourishes that served no functional purpose, but signaled to the buyer that they had graduated from the basic Mustang. The incentive for Ford was clear. They needed to sell more units off the Mustang platform to recoup development costs, and the Cougar allowed them to reach a wealthier, older demographic that found the Mustang too loud or too common. For a moment, Mercury had found a niche. It wasn't just a bridge, it was a specific flavour of American luxury that was slightly more athletic than a Buick, but more refined than a Pontiac. But this success created an unexpected consequence. By proving that you could build a successful Mercury by simply upscaling a Ford, the company inadvertently created the blueprint for its own eventual decline. If the customer was willing to pay a premium for a Mustang with a longer wheelbase and hidden headlights, why bother developing unique Mercury platforms at all? If you don't want to miss out on anything cars, make sure to subscribe. By the 1980s, the American auto industry was in a state of high-stakes transition. Front-wheel drive was becoming the new standard, Japanese companies were invading the market, and aerodynamics were replacing chrome as the primary design language. In 1986, Ford released the Taurus, a car that saved the company from potential bankruptcy. Mercury received its own version, the Sable. Technically, the cars were nearly identical. However, the Sable featured a distinctive light bar grille and a wraparound rear window that made it look more like a spaceship than a sedan. In the short term, this was a massive win. The Sable sold incredibly well, and for a few years, it seemed Mercury had mastered the art of badge engineering. This is the business practice of taking one car, changing the badges and the plastic trim, and selling it as a different brand. During this same period, Mercury was also profiting from the Grand Marquis. The Grand Marquis was a massive body-on-frame rear-wheel drive sedan built on the Panther platform. While the rest of the industry was downsizing, the Grand Marquis stayed exactly the same. It was a relic of the 1970s that refused to die. From an accounting perspective, the Grand Marquis was a goldmine. The tooling had been paid for years ago. Every unit sold was almost pure profit. Mercury found itself in a profitability trap. Its most successful products were either clones of Fords, like the Sable, or ancient designs that required zero innovation, like the Grand Marquis. The dealer network loved this. They had a high-volume, high-profit lineup that required very little marketing effort, but the brand was eroding. By the 1990s, Mercury had stopped standing for sophistication and started standing for convenience. People didn't buy Mercury because it was a Mercury. They bought it because the Mercury dealer was closer to their house than the Ford dealer, or because they wanted a Taurus with a different nose. As we entered the 2000s, the automotive landscape underwent a fundamental shift that made the original 1938 bridge mandate irrelevant. The rise of the SUV changed how people perceived luxury. A buyer didn't move from a Ford sedan to a Mercury sedan anymore. They moved from a Ford sedan to a Ford Explorer. The hierarchy of General Motors-style brands was collapsing. Furthermore, the internet had made car buying transparent. In 1939, a buyer might not have known exactly how much a Mercury shared with a Ford. By 2005, every consumer could see that a Mercury Mountaineer was a Ford Explorer with different leather and a different grille. The final Mercury lineup consisted almost entirely of clones: the Milan, the Mariner, and the resurrected Sable. These were competent vehicles, but they lacked any independent engineering justification. In a globalised market, Ford couldn't justify the cost of maintaining a separate brand, separate marketing budgets, and a separate dealer body for cars that were essentially duplicates. Most people assume Mercury died because they stopped making good cars, but that isn't the case. The cars were often very reliable and well reviewed. Mercury died because the Sloan ladder, the idea that a human being's life progress should be mirrored by the brand of car they drive, became obsolete. In the 20th century, you bought a Mercury to tell your neighbours you had been promoted. In the 21st century, you buy a car based on its features, its technology, or its specific brand mission. A brand that exists between worlds only works if those worlds are far apart. As Ford increased the quality and features of its own vehicles, the gap between Ford and Lincoln narrowed. The $300 gap from 1938 had been squeezed out of existence by manufacturing efficiency. Mercury had disappeared because the problem it was created to solve no longer existed. Don't forget to subscribe to not miss anything cars and business.